Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Flash Forum on strategy in an era of mass disruption. My name is Nishan Pillay, and I'm an executive director here at GIBS. Today, we are lucky to have with us Abdullah Verachia. As you can imagine, he has been consulting with a number of companies on the topic of strategy, especially in the context of the current disruption we find ourselves in because of COVID-19. Hi, Abdullah.
Good afternoon, Nishan. Good afternoon to everybody who's coming to the session and look forward to spending the next hour with you.
Brilliant. Before I hand over to you, Abdullah, let me just go over some protocols. Your mics are automatically muted, and we will allow you mic access towards the end if we would like you to ask any questions live. All questions are to be asked in the QA area, which you can access from your Zoom bar below. So there's a Q&A button right at the bottom, and please post any questions that you have in that specific QA area. We will address the questions in the last 10 to 15 minutes of this webinar. Please don't repeat any questions. So if you see any questions that anyone else has asked, please just like that question, upvote it, as opposed to repeating the questions. The chat area can be used for general chat, and it's viewable by all attendees and panelists. So without further ado, let me hand over to you, Abdullah.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to spend some time with colleagues, with friends, with people in the industry, really for us to talk about what's happening in this global economy around us. And so I wanted to spend a bit of time today really unpacking some of what I've been doing in the last 2 to 3 weeks with organizations in terms of how do we actually think about strategy in this context of mass disruption. And for the last 5-7 years, we've had extensive discussions in terms of this concept of disruption. What does it mean? How does it play out? What is the economic, political, financial implication in terms of disruption? But I'm sure you'll all agree with me that nothing prepared us for what we've seen in the last 4 to 6 weeks in the global economy, the impact that has had in terms of every facet of how we see and understand society. And so I want to start with this frame of reference that really speaks to the type of work in terms of the concept of disruption. Without a doubt, I think we moved into a discontinuous, into a disruptive, arguably even in an accelerated digital world, underpinned by rapid shifts in every facet of society, shifts in terms of how we understand the world we live in, shifts in terms of our business model, shifts in terms of how politicians need to engage in the type of work that they do. And I think what's important in terms of today's discussion is the frame of reference. I'm going to use today's discussion to really hone in and take a micro view in terms of how do we look at the organization and organizations in this global economy that we find ourselves in, and how do we really think about strategy? And I'm going to start with this frame of reference that strategy, in my view, is a series of interrelated choices that we take as countries, as organizations, as individuals, in terms of really understanding this ability to think about the society that we live in. And so in front of you, I've put together a slide on strategic leadership. This is very much work of a colleague of mine, Professor Nick Bernadel, who also teaches in this area of strategy. And Nick very importantly articulates strategic leadership in 4 distinct buckets. The first is he talks about the environment. And the environment is very much what is going on around us. What is happening in the external environment, in everything from the political context to the economic context to the financial services environment, to what's happening in our sector, to what's happening in terms of demography, to what's happening in terms of technology. And really, the environment, I often say, is the canvas that we're painting on. What's the canvas that I'm painting on, that you're painting on? What is the canvas that really determines the type of decisions that we need to take? We translate this concept of the environment into strategy. What are we going to do about it? What are the interrelated choices that we take to respond to this environment? And what's important in terms of that is that if the environment changes, so too must the strategy. So too must the choices that we take. And so I started with that quote that I put together this morning about the fundamental shifts. And so I think you'll all agree with me on this webinar that fortunately or unfortunately, the environment has fundamentally shifted. And so part of that is really looking at how do we take the right type of choices from a strategy perspective. So this ability to think about, the organization and strategy linked to the organization is how are we going to do something about it? So very much, what is the context of the organization? How does the organization do something about it? And then finally, this concept of leadership. Who is going to do something about it? And so I want to link these four elements in terms of, one, the environment, two, the interrelated choices that we take as organizations, three, how do we do something about this? And very importantly, what is the leadership that comes through in terms of that context? And I want to link that to this concept that we talk about in the strategy world of dynamic capabilities. And dynamic capabilities is very much around how does a firm integrate, build, and reconfigure its internal and its external competencies to address rapidly changing environments. So effectively, the concept and the theory of dynamic capabilities is how does an organization develop the ability to achieve more innovative forms of competitive advantage, given some of the path dependencies and some of the market positions that come together. And so part of this here is really this ability to think about dynamic capabilities. And part of what I want to do today is link the work of strategic leadership and dynamic capabilities into the work of Don Sull, where he talks about the strategy loop. And so I want to take you through the strategy loop. Don Sull says that in a dynamic capability type of environment, you've got to spend quite a bit of time in terms of making sense as an organization, making sense as an institution, making sense as an individual. And the objective with making sense is, in his view, is really to develop a shared mental model of the situation. And so I'm going to spend a bit of time this afternoon with you looking at how do we make sense of what's going on around us, beyond WhatsApp groups, beyond what we read in social media, beyond the fake news. How do we actually get a grip in terms of having a mental model of the situation that's happening around us? Don Sull in the strategy loop then takes this concept of making sense into what he calls making choices. Is how do we as organizations develop clear priorities that guide our action and obviously our resource allocation? How do we take some of these decisions and actions, and what then determines the allocation of resources to these choices that we've taken? He then speaks in this loop of moving from making senses or making sense to making choices to thirdly, making things happen. How do we actually ensure that people make good promises and that individuals and organizations deliver on these promises? And then finally, in the strategy loop, he talks about this concept of making revisions, that how do we create a context in an organization where we have the intellectual humility to sense some of the anomalies and revise some of the key assumptions. And so I'm going to use the work of Don Sull this afternoon in terms of the strategy loop of one, making sense, two, making choices, three, making things happen in an organization, and finally making revisions, and really translate that into the context of COVID-19 and the environment that we find ourselves in. And so let's make a bit of sense in terms of what's going on around us. And I've used a framework that I spent some time on last night in terms of saying, if I had to think about what's going on in the external environment and make sense of that broadly for all of us on this webinar, and even beyond all the people who work at our institutions, how do we really delineate it into four distinct areas using a PEST analysis? So the first one is the political context. And some of the elements that we see in this political context is that we're seeing a shift and a rapid shift in terms of global and regional hegemony. We're finding challenges in terms of how companies and countries interact with each other. And part of this is really starting to see a shift in terms of global power, a shift in terms of political power. And I think this is going to accelerate over the next 5, 7, 10, 15 months as we see the challenge for political power playing out in the global economy. One of the consequences of COVID-19, fortunately or unfortunately, is the dramatic impact it's had in terms of specific economies around the world. And some economies, fortunately or unfortunately, have been more significantly impacted than others. The second one I'm going to argue is we're going to see new forms of globalization. Yesterday, we had a flash forum hosted by our Dean, Professor Nicola Klein, and Colin Coleman. And Colin Coleman argued that it's not the end of globalization, but perhaps a new form of globalization that we'll start seeing playing out in the global economy. The third one I think we see playing out at the moment. I'm going to argue that we'll see increased state intervention in terms of how we manage the health system, state intervention in terms of how we manage the economy and the fiscal levers that countries have in terms of managing the economy, state intervention in terms of connectivity. And I'm going to argue today that we'll see increased utilization of state intervention. And the fourth one, I think we started seeing playing out in terms of access to medicine, access to healthcare, access to pharmaceuticals, access to equipment, access to supply chain. We're going to see over the next 6 to 12 months increased nationalism. As countries shore up their domestic economy, as countries start to reconfigure some of their resources to be able to protect national interest, I think we'll see that playing out. So if we have to make sense in terms of some of the political factors, briefly, I think these are some of the factors that will impact the next 6 to 12 months. The second is economic. And I think the economic factors have an enabling or disabling impact on all our organizations across the world. And the first, I think, is we're going to see a significant shift in terms of global growth. We've already seen revised numbers coming out from the World Bank and from the OECD. We've seen the Reserve Bank in South Africa really providing new analysis in terms of what potential growth might come out to. In the world, we're starting to see analysis that global growth will potentially go to -3, -4%. South Africa, very similar in terms of growth dynamics playing out. That unfortunately has an impact. It has an impact in terms of availability of resources. It has an impact in terms of the direction of economies. It has an impact in terms of contribution to the fiscus from a taxation perspective, etc. The second, and I think the biggest and most dramatic impact that we've seen is obviously supply and demand shocks. I think what we've seen in December, in January, in February in China, and China to a large extent, a big contributor in terms of production cycles and in terms of the ability to translate a lot of its manufacturing capability around the world, has had and will continue to have an impact in terms of supply. And obviously there's another factor to that is obviously the demand factor, the demand for goods and services as the economy is going to lockdown, as people stop buying the amount of goods and services that they need. And so there'll definitely be a supply and demand impact in terms of economic factors. The third one, I think, is obviously a dramatic and direct impact on certain sectors. And I've put down a few sectors that I think will be hardest hit in the next 6 to 12 months. And I think we'll find it very difficult to be able to navigate out of that context. So sectors like tourism, the entertainment sector, global aviation, the auto sector, real estate, all I think will have specific impacts in terms of the future of those sectors, or at least the shift in terms of how those sectors play out. And then the last one, and perhaps one that I think is forward-looking, I think what we're going to see in terms of the economic factor is the emergence of new business models, the emergence of perhaps new opportunities that might play out, and very importantly, new paths that might open up for specific companies and organizations in this environment. Let's translate that into the social sense-making and really some of the dynamics that are going to play out in the social element. The one I'm going to argue, and I've been speaking about this concept of cognitive rewiring of human behavior for a while, I think it's going to be accelerated. Think about your world. Think about how your world has shifted. Everything from the way you needing to provide education to young kids, if you have young kids in your home. Think about how you work. Think about the way you access technology. Think about how you access your entertainment. Think about your buying patterns. Think about your purchasing behavior. Think about your interaction with brands. Think about the fight for your eyeball in terms of new forms of entertainment. And you'll start to appreciate that we're going to see a massive cognitive rewiring of human behavior playing out, I think in the next 2 months, but further on from there. The next one, I think, is a change in terms of human connectivity. I think this call demonstrates that. This ability to be able to connect on new platforms, new ways in which we might interact with each other, new ways in which we might connect as organizations, as teams, as individuals. And I think that will shift human behavior in terms of connectivity. The third one, I think, is really this important element that I've been thinking about quite a bit in the last few days is what about the increasing relevance of social and emotional skills? I think we've seen individuals that have been able to demonstrate heightened levels of social and emotional skills. I think President Cyril Ramaphosa in South Africa has really demonstrated that in the last few weeks in terms of decisions taken from a country perspective in South Africa as a market. And so I think we're going to see an increasing relevance of social and emotional skills and also human-only skills. And then finally, I think something that's gripped many parts of the global economy is increased levels of grief. We're in a new world. A lot of what we have become accustomed to, what we've become used to, is being fundamentally questioned. And then some elements of behavior shifts that we see in the global economy. So those are social elements. And then the final one is obviously the advent or the increased utilization of technology. I think number one, we're going to see digital acceleration, that organizations are going to accelerate the way they interact, the way they engage, the way they utilize technology. The second one, I think it's in every world, in every part of society, no matter which country you live in, we're starting to see a shift in terms of the ways in which we work, the way in which we connect with teams, the increased utilization of technology to be able to have meetings, to manage projects, to be able to look at workflows, to be able to simply do the work that we do. And we've been talking about this for a while, but I think what COVID-19 has done has accelerated new ways of working. The third one, I think, is interesting because we're starting to see governments around the world looking at increased connectivity. We've seen the short-term reallocation of spectrum in South Africa because of the increased utilization of technology, and I think we'll see that playing out significantly. And then finally, I think we're going to see in the future digital-only businesses playing out. So businesses that only play in the digital space and really will become, I think, disruptors in their own industries. So Nishen, that and colleagues on the call, that's a bit of work in terms of some of the sense making that I see playing out. Let's translate that into strategy. And I want to delineate this into two very distinct areas. The one is the now. How do organizations manage the now? How do organizations and individuals manage the next 90 days in terms of their business operations? How do we think about translating this environment and the sense making that I've spoken about into strategy choices that we have to take as organizations in every part of the global economy? And so I've mapped out 6 specific areas that I've been working with organizations in the last few weeks in terms of the now and what we need to focus on. And I think what's important is that both the now and the next have to move on the same runway, on the same highway, if you want to put it that way. And so one, what is the financial impact of COVID-19? What has the financial impact been in your organization in the last 3 to 4 weeks? And what will the financial impact be in the next 90 days and possibly for the rest of 2020, given a lot of that sense making and the macro picture that I've played out? So one, I think organizations have to spend a lot more time in terms of pressure testing your P&L. We've got to look at our liquidity models. Do we have the runway and liquidity to be able to manage the next 90 days, given a reduction in terms of inputs into the business, reduction in terms of incoming receipts, etc. And so how do we do that? The third one, I think, is this ability to zoom in on every aspect of the financial elements of the business. So everything from CapEx to working capital to fixed costs, etc., and zone in and see where do we make rationalization, where can we save cost, so that we're constantly pressure testing the liquidity model of the business. The second one is managing our human capital. Is really that all our staff have had to embrace a new way of working. Have we given them the requisite tools? Have we engaged them regularly? Have we created an environment of psychological safety for all staff that work in our various organizations? The third of the now is very much the business model. And this ability to look at the business model with a granular view in terms of 2 distinct elements. One, where's the points of vulnerability in our business model in a post-COVID future? Where's the points of vulnerability in our business model in the current context? And then very much, where's the points of business continuity? Can the business continue in a very different reality? How does the business continue to survive and create sustainability in a context that's very different? So that's the third that I think we must focus on the now. The fourth is obviously the distinct impact in terms of supply chain shifts. So this balance between availability of resources from a supply chain perspective and obviously price and impact. Unfortunately, many countries and many organizations have been impacted globally. And so we've got to really look at all levels of suppliers in the supply chain and get to appreciate how do we, at least in some way, manage the risk from a supply chain perspective. The fifth one is communication, which for me is really important. How do we, in a period of heightened uncertainty and volatility, communicate with all our stakeholders? How do we really ensure that even though we have physical distance, it doesn't translate into organizational distance? And then finally, for me, what's most important in this environment is speed over elegance. In a period of uncertainty, speed matters. It's not the perfection of the model that you're putting out there, the perfection of decisions. It's really, can you play an offensive game rather than a defensive game? And for me, Nashen, what's important is that adaptability and agility continue to be fundamental tenets of disruption. And so I think what's important is that we have a team that's dedicated to the now. What we often talk about is the crisis team that looks at all of these 6 levels: financial impact, human capital, the business model, supply chain shifts, the communication elements, and finally speed over elegance. And this is the last slide that I'll spend on, is really the next. What is the next for our organization? And unfortunately, you have to start with the next now. You can't be caught in a crisis and not think about the next. And the next is where I think the importance of strategy can never be overemphasized. For me, the first of this next, from a strategy perspective, is to map out some plausible scenarios. What's the worst case scenario? What's the middle road? What's the best case scenario? And what will the impact of each of these scenarios be in terms of our value chain as an organization? Scenario planning really gives us the ability to be able to look at possibilities in a very uncertain type of environment. And so I think it's important to map out these scenarios and make sure those scenarios are specific to your country, to your sector, to your organization, to the geography that you're playing in. In putting together scenarios, I think we have to accelerate this concept of proactive adaptation. That unfortunately, the history of how our organization used to do business, the way it operated, unfortunately is not entirely relevant anymore. And so we've got to reimagine the business model. We've got to reimagine perhaps how we deliver value. Perhaps we might evolve with new models in which we're going to engage with our clients and customers and the entire ecosystem that we're operating in. The third one, again, is the people element. I think we have to gear up our workforce for an entirely new normal, aligned to that proactive adaptation and the new business models that we've got. So part of this is the importance, the critical importance of training, of new expertise, of new ways of working, of capability sets that come together. And so if we take scenarios, we proactively adapt, we look at the people element, we then have to take all of that and the sense making and make some very tough but strategic choices. And these choices, I often argue, are interrelated choices. It's not choices in terms of the vision of your business, but it's choices across your entire value chain. So if you've repositioned the business model, what does it mean in terms of operations and marketing and human capital and sales and your operations staff? And so really look at all of these choices, the scenarios into an augmented business model. The fifth one, I think there's never been a more important point for innovation. And I think we have to amplify innovation. And part of how we think about innovation in an uncertain world is that innovation doesn't sit in the C-suite of the executive of the organization, but I think we must leverage the entire organizational bench strength. We've got to think about collectively contributing to innovation. Bring your clients along and encourage them to contribute to your innovation. Because in my view, a new normal, I think, requires a new way of thinking, a new way of acting. And so I think this is the opportunity to amplify innovation in the organization. And then finally, is this ability to think about 3 concepts. The one is absorptive capacity. How do you manage all of the noise that's coming at you? The 516 WhatsApp groups, the 1,300 messages all of the time, all of the media that's out there. How do you develop the absorptive capacity to decide what's relevant and important and what's not, to categorize that and to utilize that absorptive capacity to take the right choices, and then obviously translating that into agility. And so I think organizations have to iterate a lot more. We've got to experiment. And most importantly, coming back to what I put in the now, it's speed over elegance. It's about being ruthless on execution because you have to be geared up offensively for the next. And so I think this now and the next have to run in parallel of each other in terms of strategic choices. And then lastly, as I open up to the discussion, I love this piece by Christy Ann Martin. She says, like a flower in the desert, I had to grow in the cruelest weather, holding on to every drop of rain just to stay alive. But it's not enough to survive. I want to bloom beneath the blazing sun and show you all of the colors that live inside of me. I want you to see what I can become. And this really has spoken a lot to me in terms of what I've seen in the last 3 to 4 weeks in the global economy, in terms of the sectors that I work in, and in terms of me thinking what the next, or what the now is versus what the next is. And so those are some opening thoughts that I thought I'd share with you in terms of thinking about this concept of strategy in an era of mass disruption. Thanks.
Abdullah, thank you so much. I've seen a lot of questions around the availability of this particular webinar. Although it will be sent to every single person that's been registered, so today the link will be sent. You can also subscribe to our GIBS YouTube channel, and all the content will be available there. Abdullah, it was really interesting, and you spent a lot of time talking about strategy and innovation in your presentation, especially around the now and the next. But if we were to think further down the timeline, what would you say to leaders and individuals trying to navigate the crisis as it currently stands and the urgent things they're dealing with right now?
So I think, Nishen, it's so important to be able to delineate two parts of your organization. And even if you do that in the C-suite or the executive, if you do that amongst all of your leadership teams in the organization, because I think what's happening at the moment with organizations I've worked with is we all caught up in the washing machine of the now, in terms of what's happening from a health perspective, what's happening in terms of the political decisions, what's happening in terms of the economic outlook. And we have a daily session at GIBS called Zoom at noon. And yesterday we spoke about what we talk about as what's outside of your sphere of control, what's in your sphere of influence, and what's in your sphere of direct control. I think we've really got to get raise the view in terms of what's within your sphere of direct control and influence. And that's very much your own leadership, your own ability to manage this crisis, and also your ability to navigate the organization that you work for. And so spending hours ad infinitum in terms of thinking about what the health outcomes might be, whether a vaccine will be found, etc., is important from an information perspective. But you've also got to spend quite a bit of time in terms of thinking what's the impact on your organization immediately. And so I think there are 3 or 4 important elements to consider there. The first one is, how is my organization managing the psychological safety of the staff that work within this organization? And to really ensure that communication is regular with members of staff in the organization. I think the second one is, in a period of heightened uncertainty, of complexity, ambiguity, the opportunity really presents itself in terms of saying, if there's so much of uncertainty, how do we perhaps deal with some of that uncertainty in such a way that we can ensure lots of teams think about the future that goes together? And so I think this now and the next are interdependent. Yes, I've argued that 2 teams must work on them independent of each other and ensure that there's regular engagement. But it's important to be able to look at the immediate term needs. And I would do that in a 90-day period, because I think that's important to look at what the next 3 months might look like, but without taking the eye on the ball in terms of what the future trajectory might look like.
Okay. And very quickly, what do you see some of the mega shifts? So you've talked about some of the kind of immediate future aspects, but in terms of some of the mega shifts, what do you see over the next few years, considering the massive implications of the disruptions we're currently going through?
Sure. So I think it's a lovely point, Nishen. I think we're in a period where all of a sudden we have been accelerated in terms of shifts and changes. So mega shifts that I think are important for us to look at, and that are definitely, I think, going to play out, is we're going to see a change in terms of how countries connect and engage with each other. So I think we're going to see a very challenging environment in terms of trade negotiations from a World Trade Organization perspective. I think we're going to see shifts in terms of how foreign direct investment decisions are taken. I think we're going to see a shift in terms of negotiations negotiations at the G30 and the G20. We're going to see shifts in terms of how the BRICS countries engage with each other. So without a doubt, one of the biggest shifts we're going to see is changes in terms of how countries engage and interact with each other. The second one, Shen, which is aligned to that, is a shift in terms of new business models emerging. So companies and organizations that are able to imagine new possibilities, whether they're new organizations or existing organizations who have the creativity and the capability to imagine new possibilities. This ability to think about what the world might look like and the differences and changes that we see. And we've seen some of these companies emerging. So companies that are particularly good in terms of online platforms, companies that are particularly good in terms of new forms of delivery. We've seen this in terms of companies that have thought about what would a post-COVID-19 future look like and start to put some important building blocks in that space right now. So I think that's the second. I think the third one is we'll see an acceleration in terms of digital technology. So digital acceleration, we'll see companies embracing new forms of work. We'll see the ability to manage human connection very differently in terms of enablement of digital technology. The fourth is, I think we're going to see a change in terms of the tourism sector and a shift in terms of how humans connect from one, an aviation perspective, but two, in terms of how they look at the future of tourism. So I think in the short term, we'll start to see an increase of domestic tourism playing out. And the last one, and perhaps the most important one that underpins all of this here, is this ability to think about how is it that organizations in this new normal will start to engage very differently with each other. And what I mean by that is we're going to see, I'm going to argue today, a lot more symbiotic relationships being carved by businesses and organizations as they try and navigate a post-COVID future together as opposed to individually, which has been the case for quite a while.
Thanks, Abdullah. I think we're going to quickly go on to the questions that people have asked. So I see that quite a few questions are asked about the legal and environmental perspective. So maybe you can read some of the questions, but essentially the questions are around the legal and environmental perspectives. And Dudu asked the question, do you foresee revisions in the two when most economies, including ours, are in recession? Relaxation of labor laws, for example, green targets, etc.
Dudu, it's a pleasure to have you on the call. Thanks for a very important question. Why did I leave out the legal and environmental? I think I was just trying to manage the time. But what is important critically is, without a doubt, I think we're going to see a significant revision in terms of legislation, a revision in terms of laws that play out. So as an example, relaxation of labor laws. I think labor laws have to fundamentally shift. How do we reimagine labor laws in an environment where many people will potentially work from home over the next 6 months? What does it mean where organizations start to amplify gig economy workers? So individuals who are able to provide their skills, their services, their capabilities to multiple organizations. That has to result in a shift in terms of labor regulations. What does it mean in terms of the human behavior shift when we have a black swan event like this here for the future of how we've, to a large extent, let's be honest, not really considered the importance of some of the concerns around how we manage the environment. I think the issue of the environment is going to become front and center, because I think we now realize as a global economy that what we've seen as important considerations in the immediate term to the expense and the detriment of some of the more potential impacts that might play out are going to shift as a result of COVID-19. So we all have seen the clip by Bill Gates in 2015 on TED, where he spoke about the potential of an outbreak like this here. It wasn't considered to be as relevant, as important, because it wasn't a tangible impact that potentially could play out. I think we're going to see the amplification of some environments that potentially were not considered to be so important, like the issue of the environment, becoming front and center at the G13, at the G20, at discussions at the World Economic Forum, because I think all of a sudden we realized that there's much more potential risks in the global economy beyond just economic and political factors. And so I think we're going to see the amplification of some of these other factors playing out. And then thirdly, I think how governments manage economies, how they take decisions, their speed of execution have all been questioned in the last 2 to 3 weeks. And I think it's been heartening to see how certain governments, certain world leaders, certain cabinets have really risen to making decisions with speed. And unfortunately, some governments haven't done that so well. And I think we're going to see consequences as a result of that.
Perfect. Veronica, you have a question. I'm going to unmute you. And if you could maybe ask Abdullah that question.
This is Veronica speaking. From my side, taking into consideration the hit that we're seeing in the financial market, and especially after reading this morning's article where our governor of Reserve Bank is literally ready to go out and seek for bailouts for the country. How do you foresee this country recovering from all this financial strain, taking into consideration the fact that the length of this whole impact might even be longer? What would be your suggestion in terms of the focal point for the country to at least come out as stable as?
So it's a beautiful question, Veronica. It's what has really been keeping me up for a number of nights. We've had multiple engagements in terms of how does a country navigate out of a crisis like this here. And I think the difficulty, unfortunately, Veronica, is we came into this crisis in an already weakened position for a number of reasons. One, heightened levels of unemployment that were there pre the crisis, and unfortunately, we're going to see an increase in terms of the levels of unemployment from a country perspective. And so a lot of the analysis we're seeing at the moment is a 10% increase in terms of levels of unemployment. That's ghastly for a country that already has an official rate of unemployment of 29%. So one, that's going to be an impact. The second is we're starting to see an impact in terms of economic growth. We entered this crisis with anemic economic growth of under 1%. This crisis will mean that we'll have negative economic growth for the remaining part of 2020. The third is we entered this crisis with heightened levels of income inequality. I think we're going to see that increasing. So unfortunately, we don't have the right type of ingredients to be able to buffer us from the deep impact of an economic crisis of this nature. And so we're going to see significant financial and economic implications at a government level, at a country level, in terms of organizations, and specifically in terms of how small and medium-sized businesses navigate this. Let me counteract that with some of the proactive ways in which I think we can deal with this. I think what COVID-19 has taught us from a country perspective is sometimes a crisis brings parties that otherwise would not engage with each other and brings them together in an opportunity to engage. And I think it's been heartening to see how labor and government and elements of civil society and business have come together to be able to assist the country to navigate out of this year. I think the second is we'll definitely see some new opportunities emerging post-COVID-19, opportunities that perhaps we never considered as potential from a business perspective. So that's the second. I think the third is we're starting to see a society like ours moving from a spirit of individualism to a spirit of collectivism. I think what COVID-19 has taught us is that empathy is important, is that we can only get and navigate out of this crisis if we do this together as a collective. And I hope that that will result in an increasing level of understanding, awareness, appreciation of the context of everybody in our society. That for us to navigate the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, we've got to think about South Africa or the country that you're living in as a collective rather than as an individual. And so I think that's important. I think the fourth one is we've found some incredible new ways to communicate and engage. It's amazing to see how government is able to get messaging across 58 million people from a South Africa perspective in a very short space of time. And I think we'll now start to see an increased communication level between elements of government and business and broader society. And then lastly, I think we've started seeing a spotlight in terms of how society manages fake news. I think we've really paid lip service where social elements of social media have had lots of people spreading fake news. I think we've now seen a society that is misforgiving of that and is really starting to think about, before I can share some information, let me think about whether this information is verified, whether it's accurate, whether it's true, before I actually share it. So I think, yes, we're going to go through a particularly tough period economically. I think there's some green shoots that might emerge. The devil's in the detail in terms of what the next 2 to 3 weeks or potentially what the next 3 months might look like in terms of how we as a country navigate COVID-19.
Thank you so much, Abdullah. Abdullah, before we close off, any parting comments?
Yeah, I think, Nashen, I've been thinking, it would be remiss of me in a discussion on strategy, in a discussion on strategy in an era of mass disruption, not to talk about how do you manage this as an individual? How do you think about your own personal strategy, the choices you need to take as an individual to navigate the next 6, 12 months in a particularly tough period? I think the first is that adaptability and agility remain fundamental tenets of disruption. Yes, your work, your context, how you do things, and how I do things, and so much more has shifted in the last 3 to 4 weeks. You have to shift too. I think talking about it ad infinitum won't solve it. Your ability to adapt and the speed at which you do this will set you apart and set me apart. I think the second is that I know you're concerned. Everyone is. I'm concerned too. We've got to use this time to reach out to friends, to colleagues, to family, and reach out not with an answer, but reach out to be a pillar. I think the more pillars we have as a society, the more we can rise collectively as a society, to your excellent question that was asked earlier. The third one is that our ability to manage the next few weeks is premised on our ability to move from a spirit of individualism to collectivism, because we're all in this together and we can only get out of this together. So don't create panic. Don't rid the stores of essential items at the expense of others, even though you can afford it, but think of the broader impact and the decisions we take as individuals on society more broadly. I think the fourth is that most individuals and businesses have had a massive financial impact in the last few weeks and will have a tough few months ahead. However, sometimes perspective is important. Think about individuals who might lose their jobs or businesses who might not survive. Think about our citizens who are on the front line and can't just transition to working from home. Think about the millions of people who are unemployed and really will feel the impact the hardest, and find ways in which in our very small spheres of influence, we're able to assist people in that environment. I think the fifth is somebody with young kids under the age of 7. I've become very mindful with my wife about the impact of the conversations we have at home on young kids. So having COVID-19 conversations dominate every conversation at home has a massive impact on them. So don't let the current context of what's happening in the environment around us impact our role as parents and our ability and responsibility to create an environment of love, of safety and care. I think the fifth one is aligned to that, is use the changes that you've seen in the last 2-3 weeks to create a work structure where you can really spend quality time with friends, with family, with how you map out what your future might look like. Because let's be honest, less travel, less miles, less traffic means more time at home. And so treasure this opportunity. Use it to be able to see how you can take the right choices to set up the next few months in terms of your individual context. The last few, I think small and medium-sized businesses are going to see a massive impact in the next few months. And my view, and I've said this in circles of friends and people I engage with, is we've got to really spend time supporting small businesses to be able to ensure that we can collectively come out of this year. And then finally, I think what's important for me and what I've done personally is to spend a lot of time writing. I think create a gratitude journal, share your thoughts every day, because the last few weeks have been a stark reminder, I think, of our fragility, but also the value of what we have, and we must treasure it. It's a privilege to live in the society we have and to be able to do the type of things that we do collectively as individuals and organizations. And then lastly, what's sacrosanct for me, I think we have leaders in government, in the healthcare sector, in the business sector, who are under enormous pressure to lead in a complex environment without all of the answers. Our responsibility as citizens is not to spread fake news and to really support our leaders in every way possible. And so I wanted to maybe share some of those more personal thoughts. As we talk about strategy at an organizational level, I think we also need to think about what do we do as individuals in this type of a complex environment.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Abdullah. And I'm sure everyone appreciates the insightful comments that you've made. And I think strategy in mass disruption, we've really just dipped our toe into kind of all the implications of it. And I know that we've worked together to put a comprehensive online program. I'll put the link in the comments now. But I know that a lot of people, this is an area that they're thinking about going into the next few weeks and months. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. Thanks to everyone for joining. I hope you enjoy this webinar. Tomorrow's forum will be with Shireen Chengadu, who specializes in women leadership and as well as diversity and inclusion. And to Abdullah's point, it's not really just about the organization, it's about the individual too. And there's a lot of elements that are combined in this difficult time and exciting time that we find ourselves in, depending on how you want to view it. And so I think the range of topic that Shireen could bring would really be helpful. So so please join us tomorrow. And thank you so much for taking the time and joining us today. Thank you, Abdullah.
Thank you very much, everybody. Look forward to keeping in touch.